Tuesday. We almost had some technical difficulties there.
Always.
Always, almost and always. We almost
Yeah.
didn't show up, but we're here. So today we are going to talk about qualitative versus quantitative and the age-old debate about which is more effective. Can you have one without the other? That sort of thing. So I started off in terms of posting about this topic by sharing a quote by a famous researcher from the 20th century, where he said there's no such thing as qualitative data. Everything is ones and zeros.
That's
Interesting.
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
all I can say is interesting. So, interestingly enough, I can remember early in my graduate school days of having to code data that
Mhm.
was qualitative, coding it in ones and zeros after going through some sort of analysis process. But ultimately, yeah, sure, there is a valid, I guess, perspective around the ones and zeros. But let's talk about the qualitative data and the value, or let's first talk about quantitative data and some of what you get in terms of value, but then let's double down on what you don't get. So
Yeah.
tell me about your quant experiences and where you see value.
Well, there's definitely a lot of value in it. I know you have your quant team and you have your qual teams, and the qual teams, real purists, are like, you never ever ever quantify qualitative data. I'm
Mhm.
glad you even pointed out. Yet you can. I mean, it's a different kind of activity, but you can quantify that qualitative
Absolutely.
data in many regards, and we'll probably talk about that. But in terms of quantitative data, it definitely has its its place in the world. I think you and I had a discussion about a project we worked on years ago where the inception of the product, I mean, it was
Mhm.
all around quantitative data, but that quantitative was looking at white space, the what,
Mhm.
what's out there, what tools are being used in that case, and found out, quantitatively speaking, there was a big white space where certain um, demographics weren't using
Mhm.
tools. So it kind of showed, hey, here's the space you can go into. I think it's really great. We use it a lot for A/B testing, or tracking actual metrics with how people are using a product.
Right.
So they're clicking on page X over and over and over again. And that happens to be related to everything billing, in the application. So it does give you an indication of the what they might like,
Mhm.
where they want to spend their time. But what about the why? Especially if
Mhm.
your quantitative data is telling you there's a problem. No one is clicking or not
Mhm.
finishing specific tasks. Okay, we've got the data,
Mhm.
here's a problem.
Mhm.
Now what do we do with it, and why is that occurring? And then comes qualitative data in that regard.
You
So
know,
I definitely found it useful, beyond useful, but I consider myself a mixed methods researcher.
agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. And as you were talking about that, I think the key point around quantitative is the ability to segment
Yeah.
and to identify opportunities at a high level. But when it comes to the actual uh, rubber meeting the road around creating a solution, you have to do some level of qualitative work.
Yeah.
And as you were just explaining all of that, I was thinking about when we go to the doctor and we talked about diagnostics some time back about with a baseline assessment. But when you get your blood work done during a doctor's appointment, they're looking at data, but they have to follow that data or that
Yeah.
metric up that and how it compares against the baseline. They have to follow that up with a conversation. So they've got to figure out what's going on here with you that's causing your levels to be low or extremely high, and how do we adjust them. And there's a level of kind of setting the bar around where you fit within the norm and whether or not you're above or below. But there's got to be a conversation and that qualitative discussion that
Yes.
occurs as a follow-up, and it's the same sort of concept.
It's the exact same concept. I mean, and to your point, I actually had a recent, experience with the doctor, and that, all the quantified numbers, from the blood workup. But then in the end, they had to, and one reason quanti, quantitative data is so valuable is it does serve as that baseline. So
Mm-hmm.
in my case, while the numbers look like, oh, this
Mm-hmm.
isn't in the normal range. Well, we had a baseline you could look over the years, and obviously,
Mm-hmm.
if something bad was going to happen, it would have happened 10 years ago,
Right.
because I had those same numbers.
Right.
Or what's causing this, let's dig into some lifestyle
Right.
questions to try to really figure out what's causing your vitamin D level, for instance, to be low. Do we have a problem, or are you just not getting outside enough, that sort of thing.
Correct.
So definitely agree with you on that one.
And I think that when you think about the two methods, and again, as mixed method researchers, we see
Yeah.
value in both. You start with the quantitative to look for those trends and white spaces or opportunities,
Yes.
and you follow that up with the qualitative work to go deeper in
Yep.
terms of understanding the why. Quantitative without that follow up is just data for the purpose of sharing trends. But when you think about answering the question of, and so what, it's really
Yes.
difficult to answer that question without following it up with some more inquiry,
Yep.
doing some more discovery, that sort of thing. And
Yep.
so when we think about that, I look at that kind of as the iceberg principle. So what we can see above the surface is what comes out of that quantitative data. There's a whole lot under there in terms of motivations, context, and other aspects of the individuals that you're looking at or
Right.
studying, that you've got to do the work to figure out that, and those numbers can't give you the answers.
Yeah, they can't. They can tell you when maybe something's good, maybe something's bad. They can serve as that baseline, but yeah, there's usually deeper issues.
Hmm.
I always like using examples. I think one was the print service we looked at. You could look at that quantitative data was really important for pretty much everyone at every level to know there's a problem.
Hmm.
People are abandoning early in the process or at certain points. So it did hone in on, whoa, what? We've got a problem. There's some reason people don't want to sign up. There were a lot of assumptions made, and pretty
Hmm.
solid ones were made. In fact, I think the thinking was we kind of know what the problem is. So let's dig in to see if what we did fixed it, getting into the qualitative. And
Hmm.
then we went in there, took that quantitative data, and really started digging in with the users. And well, it turned out it was very different. It had nothing to do with pricing or the things that people
Right.
were guessing at. It actually had to do with messaging, and people were dropping off because the messaging was very confusing to them. So
Hmm.
they didn't understand what they were buying, and that was it. It wasn't something they had to have. That wouldn't have come out of this quantitative data. We just knew people are abandoning. They're not checking out. They're not subscribing. So the qualitative came in, and that's where we figured out what's happening. And it turned out there were 4 or 5 factors, in that case, that were actually influencing people to abandon the service. So, but
Yeah,
without
and
the qualitative, that
that wouldn't have been apparent, or
wouldn't have been apparent. Yeah.
yeah, and when you think about that type of work, it impacts more than the product itself. It impacts the messaging, the marketing. It
Yes.
impacts that sales positioning.
Yeah.
And so when you think about the work that we're talking about in terms of that quant and then qual, it is not just about product improvements, it's about the entire kind of ecosystem of what you're building. So
Yes.
how you support it, how you sell it, market it, the actual product design. And so the the value of engaging experts to look at what are the right questions to ask on my survey, because that's a key point we didn't get into. What are
Right.
the right questions to ask in order to find the things that might be hidden in the data that we need to look into further? You've got to think and plan that quant to qual, and kind of what are we trying to get answers to?
Right.
Is, like when you think about analytics like Google Analytics, Pendo, and other tools, you've got to think about how are we using this data, or what are the trends that we have baselines or goals around, and how do we then look at where we're off from those baselines to then follow that up with some qualitative work.
With that qualitative work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can go deep. um, the interesting thing is in every scenario that we've talked about, it is an existing product, existing service, and how you use that quant qual dynamic or relationship to figure out the what and then the how and why. But where I think a lot of people fall short is understanding that quantitative data alone cannot support true innovation. True
Right.
creativity cannot come out of just ones and zeros.
Right. Right. Because you don't understand that context. You don't understand that true challenge or pain point or need.
Goal. Yes.
Right. Without digging, and that's where innovation often comes from. Right. You
Hmm.
start identifying what are those real pain points,
Hmm.
and then how do you address them differently than you are. Well, a lot of times that's going to involve a little bit of innovation, creativity, and then to go validate that innovation and creativity, you're going to need to qual metrics, in addition, again, to the quantitative if you want them. But
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just oh, go ahead, can you?
Well, I was going to say, it also reminds me of situations where people build the solution and then try to find a problem or a user.
Yeah.
And that can come from having data around a white space or a gap
Hmm.
or an
Hmm.
opportunity that exists. And it could come from just your assumptions of something that's cool. But again, that qualitative data is really what gets you um, insight into the opportunity,
Yeah.
insight into that real need that you wouldn't have in a quantitative world.
Right. Or to start prioritizing. So back to what
Hmm.
your point, that yeah, you don't have to be working with the existing yeah, product or service. It
Hmm.
can be, conceptually. I'll go back to the example we were talking about, project we both worked on. You were involved in that kind of quant stage, and later,
Hmm.
but before I was even there, in that quant stage, that
Hmm.
identified, hey, there's this space. This market has they have no product that they're
Hmm.
using to manage their office. So that was wonderful. Figured that out. The problem was, what's that mean? From
Hmm.
and that's where running off. Okay, we've got to come up with a solution for a tool to help them manage their office. Yeah,
Right.
but what's that mean in that space? And as you know, lots of qualitative had to come in eventually and say, hey, look, yeah, this isn't working. So the lever, they didn't move the needle just by identifying the white space, pumping the solution out. The solution kind of sat there, with no activity, because they had a gap, thought they had it figured it out, didn't need researchers anymore. Well, it turned out they did, with a
Hmm.
real focus on that qualitative to figure
Hmm.
out what are those needs, what are the different segments, what's the
Hmm.
context in which they're working, where's their biggest pain point. So that
Yeah.
all came through all that qualitative work, which then
Yeah.
helped to prioritize what's that solution look like first iteration. Where do you hone in your efforts based
Right.
on that data? So
Right. And when you think about that, there's also the opportunity to define who's not your target or who's
yes.
not the
Yeah.
customer that you want to solve for. And again, numbers alone won't give you that.
Yep.
You have to go and do that qualitative work to verify what are characteristics, needs, expectations of our target, who's going to pay us or use our product or service versus those that won't.
Right.
And you can't get that information from just looking at numbers or output from a spreadsheet. You've got to go and do that work to couple that with those numbers to figure out how do you break things up and make sense of them.
Yes. Yep.
And I think that the iceberg principle is a good way to look at it in terms of identifying where is that iceberg that exists, and with the quantitative, excuse me, and then using the qual work to then dig deeper and to understand where is that opportunity, how do I innovate, how do we explore creative solutions based on what we
Mhm.
know or what we've learned about this segment of the market.
Right. And I think always keep in mind back to what something you said early on around you can take qualitative data and quantify it, and that can be a useful thing.
Mhm.
So you have both things, and I think the reason I bring it up again is because I believe this project was a great example of that. Lots of qualitative research was going on of different sorts. And we
Mhm.
were able to take some of the key issues coming out of that qualitative data and
Mhm.
then categorize and quantify it. So when people were reporting, very qualitative, what do you like most about an
Mhm.
app or a service, whatever it may be?
Mhm.
Um, and you do that across 100 people, let's say, you can take that very qualitative data, highly qualitative data, and then start quantifying to go, hey, 80%, 80 out of 100, their like most was something related to billing.
Right.
This 20% was something related to, let's just say, document management, whatever it may
Mhm.
be. So you can quantify qualitative data. Same thing with, when you're doing usability testing, how many
Absolutely.
people mention some category of comment, their
Mhm.
comments fall into some category of dislikes or why you would lose them.
Mhm.
You can quantify that qualitative data and then use it as a baseline for when you make changes or
Mhm.
reapproach the situation, and you have a hard number there from your qualitative data to go, look, hey, we had 80% who indicated billing was, a really important factor. And now you only have 20% mentioning that because you've addressed those needs. So that's no longer their least satisfactory area of the application.
That's right. And two caveats in what you're describing is that the people that you are engaging to get those numbers from, that those people are representative of your target. So that's the key. Also, the key is that you're not looking for statistical significance.
Yes.
So those are two caveats in that it's that they're directional insights that take you from the quantitative directional and give you a little bit more detail to zone in or hone in on the why, the what, the how, that sort of thing
Yes.
that the quantitative alone couldn't give you.
Yes. Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned the statistical significance piece. I know both of us have somewhat of a stats background,
Mhm.
but I'm just curious because I get the question a lot, and I don't care what I'm doing. It can be something involving 10 people, a test
Mhm.
and a client, and I get it. They're kind of trained to think, okay, you're going to collect some metrics that are quantifiable from 10 people,
Mhm.
ease of use, satisfaction, good benchmarks to show where you are. Because if you're hitting at the bottom of the scale on everything, there's a problem. But how often do you get okay, is it going to be statistically significant,
Mhm. Mhm.
type of thing? And people get really honed in on that. So that's
Yeah.
always a conversation I like to have. Like, in reality, statistical significance it's a pretty heavy lift to get to significance with your number of people, but
Mhm.
also it's back to, okay, now what? So I just don't have that many product projects where I really put a lot of weight in the
Agreed.
statistical significance.
Agreed. It hasn't delivered any additional value,
Yeah.
or trying to account for it hasn't delivered any additional value. I will say that, going back to the comment about ensuring that the segment that you're engaging, or that the people that you're engaging in that qualitative work, are representative of your user.
Hmm.
This is also why it's important to look across demographic and
Yeah.
psychographic characteristics like ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, because even though you may engage people who fall within the range of salary
Yeah.
requirements, if they're all white males of a certain age group, that data is kind of skewed towards that particular group. And going back to your N of 10, if it's 10 people and we multiply that and we try to quantify it, and we say that within that 10, 6 of them exhibit a certain preference, and we can make that 60%, well, now you're saying 60% of a bigger number, or your market is feels the same way. And it's kind of hard to make that
To make that,
generalization
it is.
when you're looking at a group that's so um, homogenous. So
Yes.
you've got to be careful about making generalizations or using some sort of percentages to report things out when the group of people you're engaging are not representative of your target segment.
Yeah, and I know we spend a lot of time, just in general. I think that's probably the toughest part of our job is that
Mhm.
recruitment, making sure you're getting that representative sample. And if you're not sure, it is irrelevant, but do you know that?
Yeah.
And again, we've been on products where there's certain groups easier to recruit, or you end up heavy on some demographic where that becomes critical to adoption of a product, to whether or not they'd even use your product.
Mhm.
um, Age is a big one too, by the way.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, but well, that's another topic. I know
That's another
we
topic.
could spend this whole live stream talking about recruitment and making sure you have that
Yes.
representative. But that's really important when you're talking about people who are looking for that statistical significance. Well,
Mhm.
have you controlled for all those confounding variables? That sort
Mhm.
of thing. Yep.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And the key part of, I think, that we can bring home with this topic is the key aspect of understanding that if you see trends in your quantitative data or your analytics, understanding things from a qualitative perspective is necessary, because some of what you're seeing may be based on outside factors or external factors that are outside of your product or service. And so, using the example of
Yep.
a user is having difficulty or abandoning at a certain point in the experience or interaction with your product, that abandonment may not be a reflection of your product experience
Right.
or your service experience. It could be a matter of urgency, or that Wi-Fi connectivity is compromised
Yeah.
and doesn't allow the user to get things done in a timely fashion, which are things outside of your product that may not be something that can come across in a survey.
Right.
And
Right.
when you have those conversations, you're now able to verify, is it, something that we can do on our end in terms of product or service owner to influence or change these things? Is it something that has to do with the technology that we're using, the environment in which people are expected to use it in? So it now gives you data around that bigger ecosystem context that you want to consider and understand, um, in that whole kind of process of making improvements or
Yeah.
making changes. You don't want to make changes that don't have to be made.
Well, and especially if they don't change anything.
That's
So,
right. They may
you
not
know,
change anything.
you've spent a lot of money and a lot of time
Hmm.
uh, developing something that isn't going to change your bottom line,
Hmm.
which is money usually. You know, that most companies want to make money, so you don't want to spend money on things not going to make you money. But I think that was a good point you made about that context, and going back to that example we were talking about. You knew people were abandoning. You knew
Hmm.
people weren't signing up. You had the numbers. Why? You didn't know, but you start digging into it, and you actually find, I think this is where the hidden gems can be. Sometimes it's not
Hmm.
that big of a deal. The hidden gem is very easy. So I have real concerns with you tracking for this subscription what I'm printing. I'm very paranoid, and that may be related to certain demographics as well. I'm very paranoid
Hmm.
about that. You're about to redo a whole offering and a whole
Yes.
experience, when really you just need to message clearly, we can't see what you're doing. you know we have
Correct.
this kind of data, and it really was that simple, because people were bailing thinking that there was
Correct.
more access than there was to things, and right now, again, context, lots of privacy concerns,
Hmm.
more so with some people than others, but a lot of concerns with privacy and access to people's personal info and data, and that's part of what was going on.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it- for all of the skeptics out there that say the services or work that we do is expensive, you've just given me a whole lot of nuggets in terms of the ROI.
Yeah.
So when you think about the cost of doing work on features that are not useful or will not be utilized, or reworking capabilities,
Yes.
that's expensive. And when you think about the upfront investment of some of what we're talking about in terms of that quant to qual work, that the cost and time, and the effort is significant in terms of the gains around not doing work that your team didn't need to do, and all that
Exactly.
waste,
Exactly.
all of that waste.
Right.
So, for any of you skeptics out there, there's absolutely a case for, even if you gather your quantitative data yourself, think about when we worked on a project where we were looking at mid-tier cell phones. I
Yes.
don't remember if you were on that project, but we were looking at mid-tier cell phone users, and there was so much data around where those users resided, how much time they were spending on their phone, um, what they were looking at on their
Yes.
phone. But it required us to come in and do that qualitative work. So we took a look at that data and used it to help frame a diary study.
Yep.
But we still had to do the work to figure out what was going on and what was disrupting users' ability to enjoy and further utilize the tools. And we
Right.
found out it was the ad spend, it was the rev share and the ads. And if I looked at content and I wanted to go back to that content, it disappeared on me.
Yep.
So those are the kind of things that couldn't come out or didn't come out in the survey that we were able to glean from our qualitative work that helped that organization understand the low-hanging fruit around some of their content, but also the bigger strategic decisions that needed to be made around that rev share with
Right.
the ads, and how much of the ads disrupted the content that you were taking a look at.
Right. And that engagement
Yeah,
suffering. Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so walking away from this conversation, I have to say that ROI is the biggest reason why quant alone is not enough, and you've got to do that qualitative work and spend the money on and the time on that effort
Yeah.
to really get at the why, the how, and that sort of thing. So
Yep.
as a recap, we want to start with mentioning the fact that the key reason for this, or the importance behind this work, is to see the forest for the trees. So you've got to be able to see that big picture coming out of the quant, but you want to see the detail that's underneath that. Anything else you want to add to this one?
No, I mean, I think another way of putting it, or an additional thing you can do with that quant data, sometimes it does help people develop hypotheses in terms
Yes,
of why they're seeing it.
yes.
You're probably not gonna fully test that hypothesis with quant. So that's where the two work
Hmm.
nicely together.
Yeah, I like
Here's
that.
what we're seeing. Let me take that. We have some hypotheses. Let's
Yeah.
go do the qualitative
And let's
work.
call those hypotheses assumptions.
Yes,
Many of you say we have assumptions about what we think our market has an appetite for.
yes,
That came out of your quantitative work.
yeah,
Then, when you think about the iceberg principle, what you see on the surface is just what is visible, what came out of that data, but all of those other aspects of your user and what's going on with them and their experience, those things require more work.
hmm
In terms of innovation and creativity, what do you need? You've got to start from that qualitative work.
yeah,
And I think you did a really good job of describing examples of experiences that you've had where you can't just use that quant data. You've got to be able to go in and understand your user enough to know where are my opportunities to innovate and be creative and different.
absolutely.
And finally, that user's context. When we think about those things going on with our user in their environment that we cannot get or glean from just asking them to answer questions on a survey, that requires you to do that qualitative work. So that is all in terms of recap. Again, the ROI is very clear.
Yeah.
Any parting words, Dr. Deanne?
No, I think we covered it. Again, I'm definitely a mixed methods researcher.
Yes.
I am a fan of both. I think they both have their place, but I think sometimes people rely a little too much on the quant to drive all their
Yes,
decisions.
agreed. Agreed. Mixed method researchers are the way to go.
Yep.
Well, this is the end of our session. Thank you so much for joining us again. We will see you next week
Yep.
and have a great week.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.